Dear friends, I hope that you're able to hear better now. In the last months, we have, during the current corona pandemic, and in particularly the measures which have been taken within we have great shock and confusion with large number of the population. Daily life has changed, and not only for individuals, but for the whole social order, for schools, for families, and many people have great fear. They have fear about their economic existence, and they have fear about the loss of their freedom. You remember that how this pandemic began, and that we are actually finding ourselves in a war situation. So as the whole pandemic then developed, that from the reduction of basic rights, and when one spoke about the isolation, required isolation, and then talking about mandatory vaccination. That is another theme which is so current. And all the politicians have spoken about this pandemic, that the world can no longer be the way as it was before. And many different leaders have said something similar to this. I would like to, in the time which I've got, I would like to bring something to actually lead into the theme in more detail. And I would like to begin with by saying it's not about giving a political lecture. In the center, the child is placed and regarding children and the questions, what can we do? What possibilities are available to us that the children can come through this when they've never had this kind of situation in the world before? I would like in the first place to speak about fear, about the pandemic of fear, about the panic pandemic in which we're all finding ourselves when we speak about the pandemic, when we can actually speak about the corona trauma. And when we look at education with regard to corona, and we go to have a look and see what can help in terms of anthroposophical emergency education. And at the end, we will also hopefully come to the theme about the development possibilities. Every crisis has an opportunity. And perhaps we can look at this too in the end. It was in olden times, in the Middle Ages, in a middle-aged town, an old woman stood before her house. And a man came past her and looked at her. She didn't know him. And as it was in those days, as was often the case, she spoke to him and asked him, "Who are you?" And they said to her, I am death. I am going to bring death to the town, and I will take 1,000 people with me. He went further, and it happened the way he said. And when the time was gone and the pest had gone, the old woman went to the market to go shopping. And then she sat, and then she saw the man again passing. And then she said to him, Death, you have lied to me. You have said you would bring the pest to us, the plague, and you brought to us, but you lied, and it was 10,000, not 1,000. The death said, I have not lied. I have infected 1,000 people with the plague. The rest of them have died from fear. So this fear living in our whole society. And perhaps to begin with, fear is not perhaps something negative from an evolutionary point of view, that fear is always something that we can warn us of danger, that we can activate emergency programs. Finally, something which we can think about. For it is in our brain. It is the organ which educationists speak about. So this potential which we have within us. When this brain has a perception of danger, then the whole organism it reacts by using the stress hormones. So we jump up, and everything is drawn together in the body. And with every hit, the whole organism is in struggle, on fleeing, and when nothing more helps, then we freeze into our whole biology. And all this is all an emergency program, which was all genetically predetermined, which then in our whole biological system, that we have plans we can think about. And this stress reaction and stress behavior reaction, is that what we're dealing with? You see, this is for the next immediately, that fear is not necessarily negative. It can, of course, become negative, and we have a crisis in which many psychiatrists find this a kind of psychotic fear pandemic. In such a situation, there are completely different processes, since those which is simply planned for. And that is, I think, something which we can study in this crisis. I would like to enter into this question of fear a bit further. You see, we know since 28th of April in 2020, through a beloved minister, that the strategy of fear which we are dealing with, this was all part of the strategy. How we can come through this crisis. Then we find this famous sentence that as a strategy to bring into the population, to bring these pictures. Oh God. That in the population, above all, that we must this is the fear that we've experienced since we were born, that we and this strategy is something which is being implemented to bring the fear alive. And then a second point, there is nothing worse for a child and to be responsible for the death of someone else. That is the worst thing that one can do. So this strategy paper of the Home Office, what we can say is that he would be the one who could potentially kill Oma and Opa. And I know that simply this last point has been addressed. For the development of the child will bring harm, and that everybody knows who is anyway working with this thing. I don't want to go further in this, but I would simply like to make you aware of what has really hit hard in this. Think about the pictures of Bergamo and in the intensive care units. Think about the advertisements and these drawings of viruses, how they jump onto the Opa and so on and so on. The corona fear is a very complex issue. We all have fears, and we are fearful about infection and so on. That is the real fear. But there's also another kind of fear. And this is a political media incited fear. And there's also a third form of fear. And that is when I do it long enough that people, they become individually fearful. Their unprocessed traumatization is reactivated. And these appear, to example, out of the individual priest's biography. And it can become a traumatization. And we have spoken about many different kinds of traumas. And these things arise up if they're not processed. And there is a complex form out of these three forms of fear, out of the individual sources within us. I could name others. There is the connective fears. There is the transgenerational fears. All these things can be woken up, and these then connect with one another to a complex. And it is this complex which can be fixed on a particular object, namely upon a virus. I could just as well fix it on a group of people who I would like to exclude, or perhaps on a foreign country that I want to wage war. You learn this about this in psychology, if you wish, in the first term. So what I would like to say with this, that when we are speaking from a fear pandemic, it is not so simple. It is a real infection. There are quite other deeper levels which are part of this, which are only focused rationally on one objective. One of the greatest themes with such a kind of traumatization, because that's what it is, I would just take one thing else, that when people, what people have experienced abroad in catastrophes, that when children, when they start to suck their thumb, or when they start wet their beds and so on, this is a sign of their trauma. That only means that I feel powerless to meet this situation, this stage of development, and one which I can't feel safe in, where I must hide it from. You can also read this in this paper from the Home Ministry, how like a shock therapy of aggression has been introduced. And the intention is always that we become obedient, that we become like children once again. Just think that the state I don't refer to what our Chancellor says was courageous, but they say when the children have to be at home, they tell them what they can do, that, and when they can do whatever it is, and so on. And then you notice that when I say children infect their parents, then we are all children of our parents. So this is a whole social question, what is being set up. So it is a shock. It is an attempt to shock people, that they regress. It is a traumatization. The cause is always fear. And the people who are affected need to be protected. I can give other examples, but I'd just like to indicate this. Regarding this, this forced mask wearing. It means in the first place about de-individualization. Nowhere in this world do we recognize the individual of a person more than in his face. In development process, our eye shows itself through our face. It is not so present. Putting a mask on is a de-individualization. So it is actually a regression. You can see this further. I've said that the whole de-individualization so the whole movement to autonomy, to individualization is being held back. That all this is being pressed back. That in that the state then begins to set all the rules with all this enforced measures. For these people who regress, means, of course, they need to be protected. And we all know that I've only see these psychological precursors. And we must actually, for 50 years, psychological research has been forgotten when we just pursue this. You see, even the isolation and the simultaneous appeal to the community, draw back and don't mix with others out of solidarity for the community. Stay at home. That is such a movement. Of the dementia is also turning back. So the child is a small child and says, well, you have done that, you've done that, and so on. We know this in the school as well. So the more this occurs, that is something was what is happening. And this we can observe both collectively and individually. To see what psychological ideas are really being put in place here. So you see pandemic and stress. That is something we all know, it creates stress. So we have this low feeling of loneliness, because after all, we are community beings. And the fear brings about stress. And that has effects on our health and on our national health and our folk health. Every form of stress damages our immune system, makes us more susceptible to infection. Manfred Spitzer had pointed to this, that this is a vicious circle. That with these isolation measures, you damage the highest, you bring about the highest level of stress, and this causes then that the immune system is damaged and therefore then become more susceptible to infection. And so this whole spiral of this vicious circle of ill health in society begins. For the measures which have been implemented in our country, where all the focus is on the pandemic. And here, so fear makes sick, we could say. And when I follow Manfred Schmidt, then that the main problem is not in the virus, but with this fear. It is the fear that makes us ill. Rudolf Steiner? Had warned us of this narrow focus on the virus. And upon this very particular thing he had focused on, that when you'll fight on a virus, that then that the immune system of each human being or of the human group, of groups of people, will be damaged, and the consequence ultimately will be greater through the measures taken to control the virus than the virus itself. And Rudolf Steiner was no opposition to using such measures. It is not simply an either or, but rather as well as well, this as well. And this is precisely this which is missing. The children are very good. The children are good, and they do everything we ask them to do. I've never had any problems in the school. I've never had any problems in the end that we wouldn't follow the rules. They're good. But you see, but thereby they deny their own basic needs, because it is against the very thing about a child, about keeping their distance. I cannot comfort a child at distance. I cannot offer the child a development possibility if I speak about the pest all the time. Children can only learn to work with one another, live with one another, and in society when they are learning together, when they're allowed to be together. So the rules, the children have to deny their basic needs. It's not about simply I have a wish, but it is a fundamental basis of humanity. And what is happening now? When this natural basic needs of humanity there are group needs of individuals. So there are networks in our brain where these group needs are represented. And when I keep to rules, when I can do this, I have to replace these basic needs with others. These are the getting habits. These are habit life. These new habits overlay the old ones, and keep obeying these rules is only possible when the whole neural network is formed. Then I sense the basic needs no longer. And when I carry this further, then I don't notice them anymore. Then I will no longer be able to imagine them in life. And if I can no longer imagine them, then I have no need for them in order to realize my basic needs. And then that is the condition of a robot. The robot has no needs. He doesn't feel anything. He doesn't imagine anything. That's why he can function so well. To have this, to be a human being, that is no great human being. And basically, it's about protecting the children. As a teacher, as a pupil, as a parent, to protect the children in their further development. That is what I previously read from the Bildzeitung. Then we have difficulties. I have to say it more clearly. President Macron in France is a world-famous psychologist, and I read an interview from him, and we have said we've taken a conscious decision, a classical materialistic decision. We have protected the body and neglected the soul. But it is actually a violation, an aggression against the human being. And then he added that youth will, through this, be ruined for the next 20 or 30 years. And the societies will fall into a total lack of orientation. That is what a French psychologist said. The German education president then said a quarter of the schools will be lost. The president of the Children Network spoke about a lost generation. Michael Klunt in the parliament said, in the public meeting, the government is accused of neglecting millions of children. So one's already feeling that all the alarm bells are ringing. That the Office for Youth is here. This is from so the neglect of the children is children murder. I would like now to leave out a passage because it gets too long. There's various studies from different universities, which I could all quote, a question, an investigation by other universities and many others as well. If you read these studies, read these research works, then you can say on the physical level, on the psychosocial level, and on the mental level, and on the society level, we can see the damage being done. Children suffer from headaches, lack of concentration, tiredness, dizziness, tiredness. And even for adults, that the average that they have been putting on weight, the increase in consumption of sweets has risen drastically. So really unhealthy life has been rushing forward, and this will have consequences. And even worse, it is on the psychosociological level. 70% of children are psychologically burdened. Between 7 and 10 years old, the fear, anxiety levels have increased 70%. 39% of children complain of a lack of friendships. A quarter of all children say they're more frequently quarreling with other children. In a situation which up to then was not known among the parents. 69% of children find school far more stressful than it was previously. Bad behavior increases, sleep disturbances, developmental regression, and other problems are increasing. Boredom, 49% increase. 36% of children become less independent. They cry more frequently. And the worst came from the university. And all this is in Austria. 56% of children are becoming depressive. And many also feeling suicidal. So I could do this, go on all day long with this. And of course, worst of all, it is by the fringe side, where the poorer members, people. And of course, with the refugees and so on, this is very clear that this crisis doesn't affect everybody in the same degree. We all know this. There is the event is not the most obvious one. So when you have an accident of bus, every 10th one will be able to survive, and each one will have their own reactions. Some it affects nothing, so one of them nothing, but others affects everything. So we're very individual, and the individual factors in play here. And so, of course, it is very clear that there are these different effects. That when we look at it collectively, with 5 sisters in a small room, small house, it will look very different than when I live in a large house on the side of the Elbe. This is quite clear. that there'll be other effects, other consequences. And this can be seen in all the studies that are on this subject. There was a question to a psychiatrist once, what is the worst thing about this, the measures against this pandemic? And he said, it is the feeling for one's own life is no longer there. So that is the core of the trauma that is being experienced, which is very complex, of course. About trauma, we've already spoken, quite don't need to go into more detail. It is the breakdown of a subjective situation, that our resilience forces are no longer sufficient to deal with it. We also have to know the different forms of traumatization. There's also the generational traumatization. There are the natural catastrophes. There's also man-made disasters. And there's a trauma in our breakdown of relationship. Or breathing out into the community, whether soul level, when I sleep a little bit, and then we bring them in again, then you wake up a little bit. And somehow there rises in one, everything wakes up in one, which is there in the social wilderness, so that this can be, that this, when we breathe out into this dreamlike process into society, in a very empathetic way, like as though falling asleep. And now you come back again, and now you can experience oneself and then breathe it out again. This is the dialogue capacity for dialogue. Just think what happens with fear, how one's draw in strongly, and I can no longer bear it. And this relax it, or becoming more tense and becoming more isolated. So a forced isolation. I don't come out any further, any longer. So breakdown in relationship. Becoming lonely. Become lacking in empathy. Psychological illness as well. So you can see the body with split. I'm no longer fully present. I no longer feel the whole parts, all the parts of my body. On a vital level, it's upset. The rhythmic quality is gone. On a psychosocial level too, I can no longer take up contact. I show this disturbance in my behavior. Of course, on a spiritual level too. I no longer have a spatial surroundings with contact. The fear of touching or being touched. Just as the relation to my fellows, my relation to the spiritual world also is broken. These are the effects and all the things that we have to take account of in our education. So this corona trauma, what does Drosten say, the virologist that you all know about? That this is like a natural catastrophe. That's true. When I take the starting point that it is comes from the animals to human beings, then it is a natural catastrophe. Then it has actually, as a consequence, right through the world, that it would mean that people come together, that they support one another and help one another. You see this again and again. But now we have but I've said that we have not a traumatization through the virus, but through the measures taken to fight the virus. And there you see, and that is a man-made disaster. That is a disaster made by human beings. And that has the consequence that splits and separation occurs. That is clear. When a person traumatizes me, then my connection to other people gets lost. As is the case with all sexual abuse, this is what happens. Now we see that with the corona trauma, we have a very complex situation between a natural catastrophe, if I take this thesis, and a man-made disaster on the other hand. So there is a complexity here. All this is the result of what we're doing. And something else which I have to speak very carefully, because it now goes into politics. Now, please see this as a psychodynamic process rather than a political one. So we see a man-made disaster between the perpetrator between the perpetrator, the victim. There's a whole relationship. There's a very dynamic relationship. The perpetrator is the one who has the overview, and it is generally who does all the harm and torture. The victim is the passive one. It works from the position of weakness, not out of strength, like the perpetrator. So it is passive. It's helpless. And the rescuer, he takes the position of the good. He comes to help the victim. He takes responsibility for his problems and helps to solve it. So that is the weft when we look at this in terms of trauma, and you reflect on this. And this concept you have to continue reactivate. So long as the trauma is not solved, this relationship will remain. What happens? A man-made disaster. We've all dealt with this again and again on the conference. We know since 73 that the perpetrator in Stockholm who attacked the bank, there were 4 victims were taken hostage, and it came to an end through the police after a long time. And we had then thought about this, that the freed victims did not thank their rescuers, that the victims then visited the perpetrators in prison for many years. They had this connection. So this is really known for years. That there's this mechanism of being put beneath the one who is perpetrator to actually be the victim. When you like ritual traumatization, how do you do this? Just precisely by this route. You have to ensure the breakdown of the ego identity. And then they allow themselves to be subject, to be the victim. Then it is when we look at it in terms of the corona crisis, that there are many perpetrators. It's a man-made disaster. This is not a political, this is pure psychology here. I have the perpetrator, that is the state. That is the supranational organization. It's not necessarily criminal, but it's the one who does it. He is creating this pandemic. We are using various measures. And who is the victim? The population, not in the sense that they have been taken over, and then the rescuer comes. Who is the rescuer? The state is again the rescuer. So it's a supranational organization. And now you notice that the rescuer and perpetrator become one in their relationship to the victim. And this is also an element in the the trauma psychology. And this we can also read in this paper from 28th of April 2020. Let me now come to pedagogy. There are two places where the children have protection. That is the family, and that is the school. They have a place where they can learn, but where they can also learn to be social. And they have the school at the same time as the place to rely on, of structure, of connection. A very important place for socialization. And on the other side, you have the family. And now have a look what's happened in this pandemic. What has happened in the family? Home office being held, imprisoned, stimulated even physical violence that has increased drastically during the pandemic. Last year, 14% more children have been murdered in 1 year than the last decade. You cannot talk about security. And the schools were closed. The very institutions that could help here. And what has one done with the schools then? Everything has been destroyed, which can be destroyed. The organization, the social fragmentation, which has been taking place, half of classes allowed to come together and so on. End of all community events, the separation in all the different classes, homeschooling and internet teaching and so on, lack of movement, overweight, loss of speech. And all this about human development has been forget, because all these things you cannot learn via the computer. Because all learning processes are based on human relationship and exclusively based on human relationships. That the child learns only through that which it experiences. And actually that is everything. I could also quote Martin Buber and so on. That is what you will not get via the internet or homeschooling. Nothing else is possible. All the social distancing. So social distancing, all this. So you could say the pandemic of singleness. The children have to be quarantined, kept apart from one another. So the children are in one room, the rest of the family somewhere else at home. So social isolation, the infection risk. So like with the rapid increase in depression, 56% of children, that is hunger. This can only occur with people who have not occupied themselves with child psychology. Somebody had on their mask written, "Don't protect you from me, but protect me from protection." So the experience of someone behind the mask is very varied. But it's about, it takes one's breath away. One does not individualize, one de-individualize, because this mask is forming a kind of animal snout with it. It is, I cannot always continually hide. I cannot show my emotions. I don't have to show my true face. It is to protect. So this is like bringing one back into the adolescent age. So either you You hide yourself so you can't be seen. That is a perfectly normal behavior in that age as part of the development of identity. So what is actually happening with these masks? So that these individual questions which we're connected with this, we could expand this further. This threefold human being becomes fragmented, that we only see have the eyes, the emotional realm and the will field is covered over. That is precisely parallel with this whole digitalization process. It is the same direction. And these we can only work with the intellectual processes, no emotional ones. Or in fact, or really no real emotional ones. There are no meetings with them. They think they've got meetings, but they don't have them. And that case runs counter to them. They think that they meet somebody there. In reality, they only meet themselves and a memory of the other person, of them, and their picture of them, but they do not meet the other one. And that is precisely the difference. What is happening here with you who are here present, that we meet one another. That's something we can go further. Now let's think upon the disinfection things everywhere. We have threats presented to us. That is what is connected with the mask. So really subconsciously, it is the subliminal threats are constantly facing us. When I look sociologically, to look at ourselves, only aspects, then we see that the goal must be that we have to try and resolve these blockages, to end this fragmentation, to bring this totality together, to bring together what has been broken. That we must prevent that out of this situation, as far as prevent that the eternal suffering of people through this trauma. So what is it that educationists do in the school? But if we look at particular groups, so when I am in the school, classically I have to do with other colleagues, I have to deal with pupils, and I have to do with teaching. And if I ask now what helps and what can be done, I have to look at it a little bit more differentiated at these different focus groups. I would like to begin with the teachers. for a very simple reason. Because everybody in psychotrauma knows that in destabilized children require above all stable teachers or stable adults. That is what they really need. And so long as the teachers are not stable, they are not able to help the children. I do not want to speak about the teachers or about the connection between them and the unions and so on. I'll leave that one out. What we need for teachers is needs a way of becoming stable. So we know that all those who've been involved with this trauma psychology, that there are different stages that we have to stabilize an acute situation. That is what every emergency worker knows. That's also what we know in our work. There are unbelievably large number. So using a kind of a breathing technique and then just breathing slowly, this helps. It's all about bringing one's fear under control. We can do relaxation processes from our hands to our head. Find a way of relaxing muscles from head to feet. You can really stand on the soil and then wait. That is a method of really holding oneself onto the ground, which will then prevent us being torn away by an emotional storm. There are many other techniques that can be used alongside the acute intervention. The long-term ones too, where we begin to really work on one's own organization. How do I work with my own body, with my food, with my sleep, with my movements, my cold body hygiene? I think one can do an enormous amount. Not simple hand washing and so on. The movement, every kind of movement. There are particular curative movements which are particularly effective. Rhythmic R and so on. In curative rhythm, that gives warmth, it brings vitalization, it stabilizes. Sleep, 7 or 8 hours a night. That is statistically seen the number which is the most, which protects from lung infections. When you sleep less or more, then the potential increases for being infected. And then, of course, there's like the bitter substances. This affects one's whole mucous membranes, which resist us to various germs. When you go on to the vital level, the intervitalization, the ritualization, to build up a whole healthy daily rhythm, then move on to a social level. Then it's about artistic activities which bring strength. And this fragmentation of thinking, feeling, and willing to bring this together. And when you come on to the ego level, then it is about meditations and prayers and such things. Rudolf Steiner had offered these wonderful subsidiary exercises. As when you read Knowledge of the Higher Worlds, and many other places too, where he spoke about soul hygiene exercises, positivity, thinking exercises. All these are elements which is destroyed by trauma. Who can develop their thinking when they're traumatized? It is nobody has when you're traumatized. But that is something one can exercise. I know that when we sit in the meeting on Thursday night around 12, so at 12 o'clock and everybody wants to go home, and the colleague says at 12:30, then I look and see at my cocktail and say, that's really know what I'm going to say. Does this have to be now at 11:30? We could then leave it. Perhaps we do something different tonight than from the previous. So it's actually to rely on this. So you see, so we can work on all these levels of our organization. So all these awareness exercises. So stress is the absence of my ego. I'm not present. That is stress. Fighting against stress means being present. That is something I can exercise. And when you look at the lecture of 1912 with the by Steiner, you can see lots of exercises, and it's all about this being present and how to strengthen this presence of mind. So much for this. When I now go to the pupils, there are 5 great things. First of all, it is about my inner attitude. The others have spoken about the trauma symptoms, and see how children have changed during the corona crisis. And then a certain behavior comes with which I have to deal with in the school. And I have to know where this is coming from, this particular behavior. I first of all to recognize that it is the method which the child has found in order to deal with what it needs. And when I can understand this, then I will be able to meet the traumatized child in another way than simply thinking how dreadful it is the way he's behaving. And that is something which I can really find a way then to be able to work with these pupils. And then we have the next one we've already got to know with. To release one's thinking and feeling attitudes, and to allow the thinking and feelings into one which one otherwise block it, so that it can rise up without being blocked. And this is what will be able to allow humanity to move into the future, develop into the future. And we cannot force this, so long as it's not ripe, so long as it's not mature and spoken about. So all this speech which can actually lead towards the overcoming of this trauma situation. And if I can't do it through speaking, I can make use of art. All kinds of it. It's art and modeling and dancing and eurythmy and so on. Because art is an expression of our experiences, of our feelings, our sensitivity, without having to speak about it. We have to cultivate rhythm in order to overcome the traumatic shock. I have to cultivate the language. I have to overcome this cramping so that the child can actually come to their own creative source. I can talk about social competence, experiential education, like Lucas Mahl has referred to earlier. I can circus education. I can use experiences with my hands, which I can do when I'm kneading something or impress something upon a piece of wax, because this is an expression, an experience of self-effectiveness. I have to consider nutrition, about of care on widest levels in every kind of research. This element is an enormous element to bring about resilience. You cannot pass this one. You can study this with Viktor Frankl in his own individual psychology too. There is a third level. And this is not simply an individual method, but it is how we organize the whole school organism to make it into a secure place for the children. We proceed just as we do with the human being as well. That is, has a certain hygiene, that it has an aesthetic, that we would like to go into it, that there is color and so on. Cleanliness, order, no dirt. And on another level, how do we ritualize it? And on a psychosocial level, concerns care of relationships. Reliable relationships is precisely that which is not there in the trauma, where they become unreliable. These caring for relationships in the school is one of the few possibilities we have with this relationship trauma. And on the ego level, and to present positive pictures where the trauma brings this destructive potential. And the last point, which I'll bring there, so we have a whole total concept of how we work with children. So how we go through systematically from protection and security on the basic level, on the basic security level. So we come on the psychosocial level of relationships right up onto the mental level. To overcome this trauma level, to integrate it in the biographies, to develop further, to that the developmental process is stopped through the trauma or through aggression. You have to really bring it back into movement so that it can progress. And now to the parents. So of course, understandably, there's also trauma. We have to bring the parents into this process. So in this Corona crisis, we have put together a helpline for parents. That is one possibility. As a class teacher, you have to have contact with the parent's body. Through this contact, you have to explain what is happening with their child and offer them aids to help them at home to support their children. And just as in the case of schools, needs to be a secure place, which it is not at the moment. And then also with the familia, make it into a secure place for the children. Every trauma is always a chance as well. We know that trauma, which cannot be processed, will lead to long-term destruction. Trauma has so through the psychosomatic of a psychosomatic shock leads then into cancer. So the destructive potential of that which cannot be processed can be psychosomatic and then become a physical illness. But it can also go in the other direction, that it become a psychological problem. A personality disorder, and many other things too. It can also develop completely outwardly and then goes into criminality. So then there is violent criminality. That is something we all know. And that is precisely what we want to prevent through our trauma. Every biographical traumatic crisis also provides a chance, because when we can process what we have experienced, then it will change my life. In the same way as when I don't work also changes my life. There are many studies about this. All about the post-traumatic growth. When personalities maturity can arise. When people can actually find new life. They can distinguish from the essential from the inessential, and they were previously able to do it. Relationships then become far more meaningful than they were before, and also religious and spiritual deepening belong to this post-traumatic growth. All of it becomes more depth, more seriousness, as it was before. We can speak about a personality development. And that is precisely what we want through our emergency pedagogy. In order to bring the self-healing forces active, so that the trauma, that the traumatic experience is not going to separate or repress one, not to be taken out of the biography, but processed and integrated properly. And through that the consequences of trauma are prevented. Anthroposophical trauma treatment begins then not to prevent the illness, that one perhaps need longer to work with than normal. And so you see, that can also be the case with the corona trauma. Can also become a chance for the further development of children and young people. When we recognize, when we can take it up and address it in the way I've tried to describe. Our federal president had said right at the beginning of the crisis, the world will look different afterwards, after this pandemic. And how differently the world will appear after the pandemic, this depends on people. Because then it depends on us as to how the world of tomorrow will look. We have to create it in order to protect our children. Thank you. Whether there are questions? If there are no questions, then we'll go into the break. There's a question? For the time when we're living in the Corona time, that there's a task for the emergency pedagogy, that there is a chance for us. Yes, we can say that. So from the beginning, if the question was what we can, during this crisis, even when sitting at home with the children, what they can do in order to give the children chances to develop. We have a whole number of video clips which you can find in all different languages. How one can actually make use of them at home. Also during the crisis. And many other things as well. I could report here from the center where partially people were at home and how every day we had contact with the children. To be able to see how it is every day on all the different levels with the children. And I think these are decisive small steps that we can take. But we have the interest, found the interest for the children. We have looked after the relationships. And I think also during the crisis, we can do a lot, and it shouldn't make us powerless. But it's really about protecting the further development of the children. And that is why it is also a suffering to us as to all the things we have to do in order to prevent the schools being closed, and at the same time, what we can really offer. And we have also had the possibility, the official possibility, to support children in crisis situations. We can also bring them into school even though the schools were closed. And then also that which we have a care. And we are actually the first in Baden-Württemberg who have been able to do this with a particular permission, which we managed to arrange. Is the average young person today prepared for this situation? I think it's similar to our adult population. We're not prepared for it at all. On such a thing, not. I have got to know anybody who could say that they were prepared for it. And of course, the youth is also part of our world today. we cannot expect simply that they will show more resilience, forces of resilience, than we are able to bring them through our education. The last question, how? How do we work with people who are already deeply into the electronical media? We have to continue doing what we have been doing in a more even stronger way. What the psychologist Lamp was saying, one of the most brilliant German psychologists, he wrote a book on the road towards an autistic society. He wrote 20 years ago about this tendency and which way they would be leading. So this whole measures against the pandemic and this digitalization has actually had given this whole direction a great push, and is always in such a situation needs to have real counterbalance needs to be made, a real relationship to the world in order to on a soul level. I don't say it in relation to technologies. We must see look at the possibilities and dangers of technologies. And for children, before the 12th year, these technologies, everything which I know, has no positive aspects, not one single one. And that is why in this time, the children have to learn to come into the world. They need to meet the real world and not all this virtual world. Everything else is a dead-end road, sideways, which lead towards a healthy development. And that we have to place something to counterbalance this, but this depends on the consciousness of the teachers, because they have the possibility of placing these counterweight. And if the teachers do not do this and themselves fall prey to this, then it will be difficult for the children too. And this lack of brain development is not so easy to overcome. But it is not simple. That is why it's so important that emergency pedagogy begins at an early age. And then it is relatively simple. But when the trauma has really entered deeply into the brain, then help is possible, but extremely takes a lot of time and finance and input. But well, thank you very much.